Chapter 3. The Theology and the Spirit of Nihilism. Number 1. Rebellion, the War Against God. Our inquiry thus far has concentrated upon definition and description. If it has been successful, it has identified the nihilist mentality and furnished some idea of its origins and extent. All this, however, has been but necessary groundwork for the task to which we must now turn, an exploration of the deeper meaning of nihilism. Our earlier examination has been historical, psychological, philosophical. But the revolution, as we saw in the last chapter, has a theological and spiritual foundation, even if its theology is an inverted one and its spirituality satanic. The Orthodox Christian finds in the revolution a formidable antagonist, and one that must be fought fairly and thoroughly with the best weapons at his disposal. It is time, then, to attack the nihilist doctrine at its root, to inquire into its theological sources, its spiritual roots, its ultimate program, and its role in the Christian theology of history. Nihilist doctrine is not, of course, explicit in most nihilists, and if our analysis to this point has had to draw out implications that were not always obvious to, and often not intended by, nihilists themselves, our attempt here to extract a coherent doctrine from the literature and phenomena of nihilism will seem, to many, to carry us to yet more tenuous conclusions. In this task we are, however, greatly aided by systematic nihilists like Nietzsche, who express unequivocally what others only suggest or attempt to disguise, and by acute observers of the nihilist mentality like Dostoevsky, whose insights strike to the very heart of nihilism and strip aside its masks. In no one has the nihilist revelation been more clearly expressed than in Nietzsche. We have already seen this revelation in its philosophical form in the phrase, quote, "there is no truth." Its alternative, more explicitly theological expression in Nietzsche is the constant theme significantly of the inspired prophet, that's in quotes, Zarathustra, and in its earliest occurrence in Nietzsche's writings, it is the ecstatic utterance of a madman, quote, "God is dead." The words express a certain truth, not, to be sure, a truth of the nature of things, but a truth concerning the state of modern man. They are an imaginative attempt to describe a fact no Christian surely will deny. God is dead in the hearts of modern man. This is what the death of God means, and it is as true of the atheists and Satanists who rejoice in that fact as it is of the unsophisticated multitudes in whom the sense of the spiritual reality has simply disappeared. Man has lost faith in God and in the divine truth that once sustained him. The apostasy to worldliness that has characterized the modern age since its beginning becomes, in Nietzsche, conscious of itself and finds words to express itself. Quote, "God is dead." That is to say, quote, "we have lost our faith in God." And, quote, "there is no truth." That is to say, quote, "we have become uncertain of everything divine and absolute." Deeper, however, than the subjective fact the nihilist revelation expresses, lie a will and a plan that go far beyond any mere acceptance of fact. Zarathustra is a prophet. His words are clearly intended as a counter-revolution directed against the Christian revelation. For those, indeed, who accept the new revelation, i.e., for those who feel it to be their own self-confession, or who live as though it were, an entirely new spiritual universe opens up, in which God exists no longer, in which, more significantly, men do not wish God to exist. Nietzsche's madman knows that men have murdered God, have killed their own faith. It is decidedly wrong, then, to regard the modern nihilist, in whatever guise he may appear, as agnostic. The death of God has not simply happened to him as a kind of cosmic catastrophe, rather he has actively willed it, not directly to be sure, but equally effectively by preferring something else to the true God. Nor is the nihilist, let us note, really atheistic. It may be doubted, indeed, if there exists such a thing as atheism, for no one denies the true God except to devote himself to the service of a false God. The atheism that is possible to the philosopher, though it is, of course, bad philosophy, is not possible to the whole man. The anarchist Proudhon, whose doctrine we shall examine more closely in the next chapter, saw this clearly enough and declared himself not an atheist, but an antitheist. Quote, "The revolution is not atheistic in the strict sense of the word. It does not deny the absolute, it eliminates it," end quote. And, quote, "The first duty of man on becoming intelligent and free is to continually hunt the idea of God out of his mind and conscience. For God, if he exists, is essentially hostile to our nature. Every step we take in advance is a victory in which we crush divinity," end quote. Humanity must be made to see that, quote, "God, if there is God, is its enemy," end quote. Albert Camus, in effect, teaches the same doctrine when he raises rebellion, and not unbelief, to the rank of first principle. Bakunin, too, was not content to refute the existence of God. Quote, "If God really existed," he believed, "it would be necessary to abolish him," end quote. More effectively, the Bolshevist atheism of our century has been quite obviously a war to the death against God and all his works. Revolutionary nihilism stands irrevocably and explicitly against God, but philosophical and existentialist nihilism, a fact not always so clear, is equally antitheistic in its assumption that modern life must henceforth continue without God. The army of the enemies of God is recruited as much from the many who passively accept their position in the rear guard as from the few active enthusiasts who occupy the front ranks. More important to observe, however, is the fact that the ranks of antitheism are swelled not only by active and passive atheists, but by many who think themselves religious and worship some, quote, God. Robespierre established a cult of the supreme being. Hitler recognized the existence of a supreme force, a God within men, and all forms of nihilist vitalism have a God, something like Hitler's. The war against God is capable of a variety of stratagems, among them the use of the name of God, and even of Christ. But whether it is explicitly atheist or agnostic or takes the form of a worship of some new God, nihilism has for its foundation the declaration of war against the true God. Formal atheism is the philosophy of a fool, if we may so paraphrase the psalmist. But antitheism is a profounder malady. The literature of antitheism, to be sure, is as full of inconsistencies and contradictions as is formally atheist literature. But where the latter errs through childishness, and the most sophisticated man in one discipline can easily be a child in theology and the spiritual life, and through plain insensitivity to spiritual realities, the former owes its distortions to a deep-seated passion that, recognizing these realities, wills to destroy them. The petty arguments of Bertrand Russell, though even his atheism is, of course, ultimately a kind of antitheism, are easily explained and refuted, and they are no danger to a secure faith. But the profound and determined attack of Proudhon is a different matter, for it is born not of bloodless sophistry, but of great fervor. Here we must face squarely a fact at which we have hinted before now, but which we have not yet fully examined. Nihilism is animated by a faith as strong in its own way and as spiritual in its root as the Christian faith it attempts to destroy and supplant. Its success and its exaggerations are explicable in no other way. We have seen Christian faith to be the spiritual context wherein the questions of God, truth, and authority become meaningful and inspire consent. Nihilist faith is similarly a context, a distinctive spirit which underlies and gives meaning and power to nihilist doctrine. The success of nihilism in our time has been dependent upon, and may be measured by, the spread of this spirit. Its arguments seem persuasive not to the degree that they are true, but to the degree that this spirit has prepared men to accept them. What then is the nature of the nihilist faith? It is the precise opposite of the Christian faith, and so not properly called faith at all. Where Christian faith is joyous, certain, serene, loving, humble, patient, submitting in all things to the will of God, its nihilist counterpart is full of doubt, suspicion, disgust, envy, jealousy, pride, impatience, rebelliousness, blasphemy, one or more of these qualities predominating in any given personality. It is an attitude of dissatisfaction with self, with the world, with society, with God. It knows but one thing, that it will not accept things as they are, but must devote its energies either to changing them or fleeing from them. It was well described by Bakunin as, quote, the sentiment of rebellion, this satanic pride which spurns subjection to any master whatever, whether of divine or human origin, end quote. Nihilist rebellion, like Christian faith, is an ultimate and irreducible spiritual attitude, having its source and its strength in itself, and of course, in the supernatural author of rebellion. We shall be unprepared to understand the nature or the success of nihilism, or the existence of systematic representatives of it like Lenin and Hitler, if we seek its source anywhere but in the primal satanic will to negation and rebellion. Most nihilists, of course, understand this will as something positive, as the source of independence and freedom, but the very language in which men like Bakunin find it necessary to express themselves betrays the deeper import of their words to anyone prepared to take them seriously. The nihilist rejection of Christian faith and institutions, then, is a result not so much of a loss of faith in them and in their divine origin, though no nihilism being pure, this skepticism is present also, as of rebellion against the authority they represent and the obedience they command. The literature of 19th century humanism, socialism, and anarchism has as its constant theme the non-serviam. God the Father, together with all his institutions and ministers, is to be overthrown and crushed, and triumphant man is to ascend. A triumphant man is to ascend his throne to rule in his own right. This literature, intellectually mediocre, owes its power and its continuing influence to its righteous indignation against the injustices and tyranny of the Father and his earthly representatives, to its passion, that is, and not to its truth. This rebellion, this messianic fervor that animates the greatest revolutionaries, being an inverse faith, is less concerned to demolish the philosophical and theological foundations of the old order. That task can be left to the less fervent souls, than to destroy the rival faith which gave it life. Doctrines and institutions may be, quote, reinterpreted, emptied of their Christian content and filled with a new nihilist content. But Christian faith, the soul of these doctrines and institutions, and alone capable of discerning this, quote, reinterpretation and effectively opposing it, must be completely destroyed before it can itself be, quote, reinterpreted. This is a practical necessity if nihilism is to triumph. More, it is a psychological and even spiritual necessity, for nihilist rebellion dimly senses that the truth resides in Christian faith, and its jealousy and its uneasy conscience will not be appeased until the total abolition of faith has justified its position and, quote, proved its truth. On a minor scale, this is the psychology of the Christian apostate. On a major scale, it is the psychology of Bolshevism. The systematic Bolshevik campaign to uproot Christian faith, even when it has clearly ceased to be a danger to the stability of the atheist state, has no rational explanation. It is rather part of a ruthless war to the death against the only force capable of standing against Bolshevism and, quote, disproving it. Nihilism has failed as long as true Christian faith remains in a single person, for that person will be a living example of truth that will prove vain all the impressive worldly accomplishments of which nihilism is capable, and will refute in his person all the arguments against God and the kingdom of heaven. Man's mind is supple, and it can be made to believe anything to which his will inclines. In an atmosphere permeated with nihilistic fervor, such as still exists in the Soviet Union, the soundest argument can do nothing to induce belief in God, in immortality, in faith. But a man of faith, even in this atmosphere, can speak to the heart of man and show by his example that what is impossible to the world and to the best of human intentions is still possible to God and to faith. Nihilist rebellion is a war against God and against truth, but few nihilists are fully aware of this. Explicit theological and philosophical nihilism is the preserve of a few rare souls. For most, nihilist rebellion takes the more immediate form of a war against authority. Many whose attitudes towards God and truth may seem ambiguous reveal their nihilism most clearly in their attitude toward, in Bakunin's words, the, quote, cursed and fatal principle of authority, end quote. The nihilist, quote, revelation thus declares most immediately the annihilation of authority. Some apologists are fond of citing corruption, abuses, and injustices in the old order as justification for rebellion against it. But such things, the existence of which no one will deny, have been often the pretext, but never the cause, of nihilist outbursts. It is authority itself that the nihilist attacks. In the political and social order, nihilism manifests itself as a revolution that intends not a mere change of government or a more or less widespread reform of the existing order, but the establishment of an entirely new conception of the end and means of government. In the religious order, nihilism seeks not a mere reform of the church, and not even the foundation of a new church or religion, but a complete refashioning of the idea of religion and of spiritual experience. In art and literature, the nihilist is not concerned with the modification of old aesthetic canons regarding subject matter or style, nor with the development of new genres or traditions, but with a whole new approach to the question of artistic creation and a new definition of art. It is the very first principles of these disciplines, and no mere remote or faulty application of them, that nihilism attacks. The disorder so apparent in contemporary politics, religion, art, and other realms as well, is a result of the deliberate and systematic annihilation of the foundations of authority in them. Unprincipled politics and morality, undisciplined artistic expression, indiscriminate religious experience, all are the direct consequence of the application to once stable sciences and disciplines of the attitude of rebellion. Nihilist rebellion has entered so deeply into the fiber of our age that resistance to it is feeble and ineffective. Popular philosophy and most serious thought devote their energies to apology for it. Camus, in fact, sees in rebellion the only self-evident truth left to men of today, the only belief remaining to men who can no longer believe in God. His philosophy of rebellion is a skillful articulation of the spirit of the age, but it is hardly to be taken seriously as anything more than that. Thinkers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were as anxious as Camus is today to do without theology, to base all their knowledge on, quote, nature. But if rebellion is all the natural man may know today, why is it that the natural man of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment seemed to know much more and thought himself to be a much nobler being? They took too much for granted, is the usual answer, and lived on Christian capital without knowing it. Today we are bankrupt and know it. Contemporary man, in a word, is disillusioned. But strictly speaking, one must be disillusioned of an illusion. If men have fallen away, not from illusion, but from truth, and that is indeed the case, then profounder reasoning is required to explain their present plight. That Camus can accept the rebel as the natural man, that he can find everything absurd except rebellion, means only one thing. He has been well trained in the school of nihilism. he has learned to accept the fight against God as the natural state of man. To such a state has nihilism reduced men. Before the modern age, the life of man was largely conditioned by the virtues of obedience, submission, and respect to God, to the church, to the lawful earthly authorities. To the modern man whom nihilism has, quote, enlightened, this old order is but a horrible memory of some dark past from which man has been, quote, liberated. Modern history has been the chronicle of the fall of every authority. The old order has been overthrown, and if a precarious stability is maintained in what is unmistakably an age of transition, a new order is clearly in the making. The age of the rebel is at hand. Of this age, the nihilist regimes of this century have given a foretaste, and the widespread rebelliousness of the present day is a further portent. Where there is no truth, the rebellious will reigns. But the will, said Dostoevsky, with his customary insight into the nihilist mentality, is closest to nothing. The most assertive are closest to the most nihilistic. He who has abandoned truth and every authority founded upon that truth has only blind will between himself and the abyss. And this will, whatever its spectacular achievements in its brief moment of power, those of Hitler and of Bolshevism have so far been the most spectacular, is irresistibly drawn to that abyss, as to some immense magnet that has searched out the answering abyss within itself. In this abyss, this nothingness of man who lives without truth, we come to the very heart of nihilism. Number 2, the worship of nothingness. Nothingness, in the sense in which modern nihilism understands it, is a concept unique to the Christian tradition. The non-being of various Eastern traditions is an entirely different, a positive conception. The nearest they approach to the idea of nihil is their obscure notion of primal chaos. God has spoken only obscurely and indirectly to other peoples. To his chosen people alone, he has revealed the fullness of truth concerning the beginning and the end of things. To other peoples, indeed, and to the unaided reason, one of the most difficult of Christian doctrines to understand is that of creatio ex nihilo. God's creation of the world, not out of himself, not out of some pre-existent matter or primal chaos, but out of nothing. In no other doctrine is the omnipotence of God so plainly stated. The never-dimmed marvelousness of God's creation has its foundation precisely in this fact, that it was called into existence from absolute non-existence. But what relation, it may be asked, has nihilism to such a doctrine? It has the relation of denial. What, says Nietzsche in a statement whose last sentence we have already cited in a different context, see page 31 above, does nihilism mean? That the highest values are losing their value. There is no goal. There is no answer to the question, why? Nihilism, in a word, owes its whole existence to a negation of Christian truth. It finds the world absurd, not as a result of dispassionate research into the question, but through inability or unwillingness to believe its Christian meaning. Only men who once thought they knew the answer to the question why could be so disillusioned to discover that there was no answer after all. Yet if Christianity were merely one religion or philosophy among many, its denial would not be a matter of such great import. Joseph de Maistre, who was astute in his criticism of the French Revolution, even if his more positive ideas are not to be trusted, saw the point precisely, and at a time when the effects of nihilism were far less obvious than they are today. There have always been some forms of religion in the world and wicked men who oppose them. Impiety was always a crime, too, but only in the bosom of the true religion can there be real impiety. Impiety has never produced in times past the evils which it has brought forth in our day, for its guilt is always directly proportional to the enlightenment which surrounds it. Although impious men have always existed, there never was before the 18th century, and in the heart of Christendom, an insurrection against God. No other religion has affirmed so much and so strongly as Christianity, because its voice is the voice of God, and its truth is absolute, and no other religion has had so radical and uncompromising an enemy as nihilism, for no one can oppose Christianity without doing battle with God himself. To fight the very God who has created him out of nothingness requires, of course, a certain blindness as well as the illusion of strength. But no nihilist is so blind that he fails to sense, however dimly, the ultimate consequences of his action. The nameless anxiety of so many men today testifies to their passive participation in the program of antitheism. The more articulate speak of an abyss that seems to have opened up within the heart of man. This anxiety and this abyss are precisely the nothingness out of which God has called each man into being, and back to which man seems to fall when he denies God, and in consequence denies his own creation and his own being. This fear of falling out of being, as it were, is the most pervasive kind of nihilism today. It is the constant theme of the arts and the prevailing note of absurdist philosophy. But it is more conscious nihilism, the nihilism of the explicit anti-theist, that has been more directly responsible for the calamities of our century. To the man afflicted with such nihilism, the sense of falling into the abyss, far from ending in passive anxiety and despair, is transformed into a frenzy of satanic energy that impels him to strike out at the whole of creation and bring it, if he can, plummeting into the abyss with him. Yet in the end, a Proudhon, a Bakunin, a Lenin, a Hitler, however great their temporary influence and success, must fail. They must even testify against their will to the truth they would destroy. For their endeavor to nihilize creation and so annul God's act of creation by returning the world to the very nothingness from which it came is but an inverted parody of God's creation. And they, like their father the devil, are but feeble apes of God, who, in their attempt, quote, prove the existence of the God they deny, and in their failure testify to his power and glory. No man, we have said often enough, lives without a God. Who then or what is the God of the nihilist? It is nihil, nothingness itself, not the nothingness of absence or non-existence, but of apostasy and denial. It is the corpse of the dead God which so weighs upon the nihilist. The God hitherto so real and so present to Christian men cannot be disposed of overnight. So absolute a monarch can have no immediate successor. So it is that, at the present moment of man's spiritual history, a moment admittedly of crisis and transition, a dead God, a great void, stands at the center of man's faith. The nihilist wills the world, which once revolved about God, to revolve now about nothing. Can this be? An order founded upon nothing? Of course it cannot. It is self-contradiction, it is suicide, but let us not expect coherence from modern thinkers. This is in fact the point modern thought and its revolution have reached in our time. If it is a point that can be held only for a moment, if it has been reached only to be very quickly superseded, its reality cannot for all that be denied. There are many signs which we shall examine in their place, that the world has begun to move out of the age of nihilism since the end of the last great war and towards some kind of, quote, new age. But in any case, this new age, if it come, will not see the overcoming of nihilism, but its perfection. The revolution reveals its truest face in nihilism without repentance, and there has been none. What comes after can only be a mask hiding that same face. whether overtly in the explicit anti-theism of Bolshevism, fascism, Nazism, or passively in the cult of indifference and despair, absurdism and existentialism, modern man has clearly revealed his resolve to live henceforth without God, that is to say, in a void, in nothingness. Before our century, the well-meaning could still delude themselves that liberalism and humanism, science and progress, the revolution itself, and the whole path of modern thought were something positive and even, in some vague sense, had God on their side. It is quite clear now that the revolution and God can have nothing to do with each other. There is no room in a consistent modern philosophy for God at all. All further modern thought, whatever disguises it may assume, must presuppose this, must be built upon the void left by the death of God. The revolution, in fact, cannot be completed until the last vestige of faith in the true God is uprooted from the hearts of men, and everyone has learned to live in this void. From faith comes coherence. The world of faith, which was once the normal world, is a supremely coherent world because in it everything is oriented to God as to its beginning and end, and obtains its meaning in that orientation. Nihilist rebellion in destroying that world has inspired a new world, the world of the absurd. This word, very much in fashion at the present time to describe the plight of contemporary man, has actually, if properly understood, a profound meaning. For if nothingness be the center of the world, then the world, both in its essence and in every detail, is incoherent. It fails to hold together. It is absurd. No one has more clearly and succinctly described this world than Nietzsche, its prophet, and in the very passage where he first proclaimed its first principle, the death of God. Quote, "We have killed him, God, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done it? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the whole horizon? What did we do when we loosened this earth from its sun? Whither does it move now? Whither do we move? Away from all suns? Do we not dash on unceasingly, backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an above and below? Do we not stray as through infinite nothingness? Does not empty space breathe upon us? Has it not become colder? Does not the night come on continually darker and darker?" End quote. Such is the nihilist universe, in which there is neither up nor down, right nor wrong, true nor false, because there is no longer any point of orientation. Where there was once God, there is now nothing. Where there were once authority, order, certainty, faith, there are now anarchy, confusion, arbitrary and unprincipled action, doubt and despair. This is the universe so vividly described by the Swiss Catholic Max Picard as the world of, quote, the flight from God, and alternatively as the world of discontinuity and disjointedness. Nothingness, incoherence, antitheism, hatred of truth, what we have been discussing in these pages is more than mere philosophy, more even than a rebellion of man against God he will no longer serve. A subtle intelligence lies behind these phenomena, and on an intricate plan which philosopher and revolutionary alike merely serve and do not command. We have to do the work of Satan. Many nihilists, indeed, far from disputing this fact, glory in it. Bakunin found himself on the side of Satan, the eternal rebel, the first freethinker and emancipator of worlds. Nietzsche proclaimed himself Antichrist. Poets, decadents, and the avant-garde in general, since the Romantic era, have been greatly fascinated by Satanism, and some have tried to make it into a religion. Proudhon, in so many words, actually invoked Satan. Quote, "Come to me, Lucifer, Satan, whoever you may be. Devil whom the faith of my fathers contrasted with God and the church, I will act as spokesman for you and will demand nothing of you." End quote. What is the Orthodox Christian to think of such words? Apologists and scholars of nihilist thought, when they regard such passages as worthy of comment at all, usually dismiss them as imaginative exaggerations, as bold metaphors to express a perhaps childish rebellion. To be sure, it must be admitted that there is a juvenile quality in the expression of most modern, quote, Satanism. Those who so easily invoke Satan and proclaim Antichrist can have very little awareness of the full import of their words, and few intend them to be so taken with entire seriousness. This naive bravado reveals, nonetheless, a deeper truth. The nihilist revolution stands against authority and order, against truth, against God, and to do this is, clearly, to stand with Satan. The nihilist, since he usually believes in neither God nor Satan, may think it mere cleverness to defend, in his fight against God, the age-old enemy of God. But while he may think he is doing no more than playing with words, he is actually speaking the truth. De Maestre and later Donoso Cortes, writing in a day when the Church of Rome was more aware of the meaning of the revolution than it is now, and was still capable of taking a strong stand against it, called the revolution a satanic manifestation, and historians smile at them. Fewer perhaps smile today when the same phrase is applied, though rarely with full seriousness even now, to National Socialism or Bolshevism, and some may even begin to suspect that there exist forces and causes that have somehow escaped the attention of their enlightened gaze. That concludes Chapter 3 of Nihilism. I hope you enjoyed that.